There are crimes that shock the world. And then, there are crimes that make the world question reality itself. Because sometimes, the most terrifying part of a murder is not how it happened, but the fact that everything that followed makes absolutely no sense. In the spring of 1922, in a quiet, rural region of Bavaria, Germany, a small farm called Hinterkaifeck became the center of one of the most disturbing unsolved murders in history. 6 people went to sleep there. And over the next 2 days, someone or something stayed behind. Not to escape, not to hide, but to live inside the house with the dead. Hinterkaifeck was not a place people passed through. It was a place you went to, or avoided entirely. A small, isolated farm surrounded by thick forest and muddy fields, it sat about an hour outside Munich. The family who lived there were farmers. Andreas Gruber, the strict, suspicious patriarch Kazilia Gruber, his wife, widowed daughter Victoria Little Kazilia, Victoria's young daughter, and a newborn baby. Also living on the property was a recently hired maid. But what made this farm unusual wasn't just the people, it was the feeling. Because in the weeks leading up to the murders, something strange had begun to happen. Something that the family could not explain, and something they should have taken as a warning. It started with footprints, fresh footprints in the snow, leading into the farm, but never leaving. At first, Andreas Gruber assumed it was a passerby, maybe a hunter or someone lost. But there was a problem. No one had reported seeing anyone arrive. And more importantly, there were no footprints leaving the property. It was as if someone had walked onto the farm and simply vanished into thin air. Then came the noises. Late at night, when the farm should have been silent, footsteps in the attic, soft at first, then heavier, dragging sounds, sometimes even voices, faint, muffled, impossible to understand. The Gruber family began sleeping uneasily. Doors were locked, windows were checked. But every morning something else would be wrong. Tools slightly moved, food missing, and once, a key that no one could explain how it got there. Still, Andreas refused to leave, refused to call authorities, refused to believe what his own family was telling him. Because to him, the idea of an intruder living in their attic was impossible. On March 31st, 1922, things escalated. And this time, it wasn't just sounds. Andreas Gruber discovered something horrifying, a strange set of footprints inside the house itself, not outside, inside, leading from the front door up into the attic. But here is what makes this case different from almost any other in history. No one in the house admitted to going into the attic. Not the family, not the maid, no visitors. And yet, someone had been living there, and worse, they were still there. That night, neighbors later recalled something unusual. Smoke coming from the chimney, light in the farmhouse windows, and movement. Not the normal movement of a sleeping family, but activity, like someone was awake, working, watching, waiting. Inside Hinterkaifeck, something was happening, something no one outside could see, and no one inside could stop. Then came the silence. For 2 full days, no one saw the Gruber family. No one heard from them. No one saw smoke from the chimney. No one saw movement. And in a rural farming community in 1922, Germany, that was not normal. Neighbors began to worry. Eventually, one man decided to go to the farm to check to see if everything was all right. He walked toward the house and noticed something strange immediately. The animals were still alive. Cattle were fed. dogs were alive, but no humans were visible. He called out. No answer. He stepped closer. And that's when he noticed the barn door was slightly open. What he would find next would turn Hinterkaifeck into a name that would echo for over a century. Inside the barn, he found the bodies, one by one, the entire Gruber family, brutally murdered, hidden within the property they had called home. But what made the scene even more disturbing wasn't just the violence, it was the signs of something far worse. Because evidence suggested something impossible. Someone had stayed on the farm after the murders for days. Someone had fed the animals. Someone had eaten food from the kitchen. Someone had even used the house after the killings. Police arrived. Investigations began. Suspects were questioned, rumors spread, but nothing ever fully made sense. Because every clue led to a dead end. Every theory collapsed under its own weight. And the most terrifying possibility remained. The killer didn't just strike and run. The killer may have lived with the victims for days, inside the same house, walking through the same rooms, standing over the same bodies, in silence. And that is where the story truly begins. Because Hinterkaifeck is not just a murder case. It is a mystery built on impossible details. Footprints that came but never left. A house that was watched but never entered. And a killer who may have never left the scene at all. When police finally arrived at Hinterkaifeck, they didn't step into a crime scene. They stepped into something far more disturbing. A place that felt occupied. Not abandoned, not escaped, but still lived in. Because everything about the farm suggested one chilling possibility. Whoever committed the murders hadn't run away in panic. They had stayed. Inside the barn and surrounding buildings, officers found the Gruber family, Andreas Gruber, Cecilia Gruber, Victoria Gabriel Little Casilia, the infant child, and the maid, all dead. All brutally attacked with a farm tool. But the violence wasn't the most disturbing detail. It was the behavior after the murders. Because nothing was taken. No robbery, no valuables stolen, no sign of escape urgency. Instead, the scene suggested time spent inside the property after the killings. In the farmhouse kitchen, investigators found something that froze them. Freshly prepared food. Not old, not rotting. Recent. Bread had been cut. Meat had been moved. A stove had been lit after the murders. This wasn't the behavior of a fleeing killer. This was the behavior of someone who believed they were safe. Someone who was comfortable enough to remain inside the house with the dead. Then came the most chilling detail of all, the footprints. Outside the house, investigators found a disturbing pattern. Footprints entering the farm, footprints circling the house, footprints leading to the barn, and footprints going back into the house again. But what they did not find were footprints leaving the property in any normal escape pattern. It was as if the killer had never properly left the farm at all, only moved through it, over and over. Police then searched the attic, and what they found changed the direction of the entire investigation. A hidden living space, evidence that someone had been staying there for an extended period. Bedding materials, food remnants, personal items that did not belong to the family. Someone had been watching the Grubers, possibly for weeks, maybe longer, and they had been doing it from inside the house itself. Investigators began forming a terrifying idea. What if the killer wasn't an outsider who broke in, but someone who was already there, Someone who had access, someone who knew the layout, someone who understood the family's routines. Because nothing about the crime suggested forced entry during the attack. Instead, it suggested something much worse: familiarity. Neighbors reported something unusual the night before the killings. Smoke from the chimney, movement in the windows, and even sounds of hammering from the barn. But when investigators checked later, there was no sign of normal activity, only silence. It was as if someone had been preparing, not for escape, but for what came next. As police dug deeper, several suspects emerged, but none fully fit. The traveling worker theory, a drifter passing through the area. Problem: no confirmed sightings entering or leaving at the right time. The former farmhand, a dismissed worker who knew the property. Problem: no solid evidence placing him at the farm during the critical window. The neighbor theory, someone nearby with access and familiarity. Problem: no motive strong enough for total family annihilation. The internal conflict theory, someone already living on the farm. This theory terrified investigators the most, because it meant the killer didn't need to enter. They were already inside. One officer later described something he could never forget: the feeling of walking through the house and sensing it was still occupied, not by the living, but by someone who had been there recently enough that the house itself still felt warm, still active, still used, as if the killer had simply stepped out and might return at any moment. Despite weeks of searching, no arrest was made, no conclusive suspect identified, no weapon definitively traced, and no explanation for the attic occupant ever proven. Over time, the case began to collapse under its own weight. Evidence was lost, witness statements conflicted, and the farm itself was eventually demolished. But the questions remained, because one detail could not be explained away. How could someone live inside a house with 6 dead bodies and not be seen leaving? Over the years, one theory has remained strongest. The killer never left immediately. They stayed on the farm for days, living among the dead, eating their food, moving through their home, listening to the silence they created, not hiding from justice, but waiting for reasons no one has ever been able to fully explain. Hinterkaifeck is no longer just a murder case. It is a psychological puzzle, one where every answer creates a new question, and every explanation leads back to the same impossible idea. Someone was living inside that house after the murders. By the time investigators stepped back from Hinterkaifeck, one truth had already settled in. This was not a normal murder case, not even a normal unsolved case, because nothing about it behaved like logic. It behaved like presence, like someone who didn't just commit a crime and flee, but someone who inhabited the aftermath. And that raises the most disturbing question of all: what kind of mind stays behind a massacre? Most murder cases follow patterns: panic, escape, cover-up, distance. But Hinterkaifeck didn't show that. Instead, everything suggested time spent after the violence. That detail changes everything because it removes the idea of urgency and replaces it with something colder: control. To understand the psychology of this case, investigators later reconstructed the farm layout. What they found was critical. Hinterkaifeck wasn't just isolated, it was enclosed. Dense forest on multiple sides, one main access path, few neighbors, and a house structure that allowed someone to move inside without being seen from outside. That means something terrifying in hindsight. Once inside, A person could remain unnoticed for a long time, especially if no one came looking, and no one did. Not immediately. After the first signs of disturbance, footsteps, noises, missing items, the Gruber family did not leave. That decision is central to the entire tragedy. They stayed. They argued. They investigated themselves, and they isolated the problem inside the house. Instead of removing themselves from danger, they lived inside it. That gave the unknown intruder something powerful: time. At some point, something shifted. Not physically at first, but psychologically. The house stopped being home. It became a shared space between a family and something they could not see. And in cases like this, once fear becomes normalized, it stops being resistance and becomes routine. That is where control begins. Not with violence, but with acceptance of the unknown. Over the years, criminologists have proposed several psychological profiles, none confirmed, but all unsettling. This theory suggests the killer was already observing the farm before entering. Not a random attacker, but someone who studied routines, patterns, weak points. And when they finally entered, they weren't surprised by anything because they already knew the house. This would explain familiar movement inside the property, confidence in staying after the crime, lack of urgency in escape. But it doesn't explain how they avoided detection for so long. A more disturbing theory suggests the killer wanted more than murder. They wanted occupation, not theft, not revenge, but control of space. In this interpretation, the murders are not the end goal. They are the beginning, because the killer doesn't leave the farm after. They remain inside it, living in the environment they destroyed. Another possibility is collapse. A mind that entered the house for one reason and lost structure once inside. In this version, the killer enters for burglary or confrontation, encounters resistance, commits murder impulsively, then becomes detached from reality afterward. But this theory struggles with one major detail: the organized behavior after the killings. Cooking, moving through rooms, feeding animals. That is not panic, that is function. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence remains unchanged across all reports. The livestock survived. They were fed. They were maintained. This wasn't accidental. Someone took care of them after the murders, which forces a horrifying implication. The killer didn't just stay inside the house. They maintained the farm as if they belonged there. Investigators later described a strange feeling about the entire case. Nothing about it felt like a crime scene frozen in time. It felt ongoing, as if the event didn't end on the night of the murders. It continued, in small actions, in movement, in survival routines, performed by someone still present. That idea breaks the usual understanding of homicide, because it introduces something rare: a killer who does not exit the narrative. If the timeline is accurate, there were at least 2 days between the murders and discovery. During that time, the house was not empty. Food was consumed. Animals were tended, doors were opened and closed, and yet no one saw the killer leave. Which means one of two things: either they left in a way no one noticed, or they never truly left at all. Some early investigators quietly considered a disturbing possibility. What if the killer was still inside when people arrived? Not hiding in the attic, not outside fleeing, but somewhere within the property during discovery. That idea was never proven, but it was never fully dismissed either, because the behavior patterns didn't rule it out. They only made it harder to imagine. Eventually, Hinterkaifeck faded from active investigation. Records were archived. Suspects died. The farm was demolished. But the case never truly closed, because closure requires understanding, and understanding requires logic. This case offers neither, only fragments and silence. At this point, Hinterkaifeck stops being just a historical murder. It becomes something more unsettling. A study of what happens when fear is allowed to live inside a home. By the time the investigation slowed to a standstill, Hinterkaifeck had already done something unusual to the people studying it. It didn't just confuse them. It changed the way they thought about crime itself. Because every suspect they examined, every theory they built, every possible explanation they tested, broke apart under one simple problem. Nothing about the case behaved like a normal human exit, and that left investigators staring at the same unsettling conclusion. If the killer wasn't found leaving, then maybe they were never meant to be found leaving at all. Early on, attention turned to the idea of a drifter, a passing worker, someone who might have seen the farm as an opportunity. On paper, it made sense. Remote location, isolated family, limited witnesses. But in practice, it collapsed quickly because no one reported a stranger entering the area at the critical time. No village sightings matched the timeline. No confirmed travel records existed. And most importantly, there was no clear path in or out that aligned with the physical evidence. It was a suspect built on possibility, not proof. And Hinterkaifeck needed proof, not imagination. Then came a more grounded theory. A former farmhand, someone who knew the property layout, someone familiar with routines and hidden spaces. This theory gained attention because familiarity explained something important. How someone could move inside the house without hesitation. But it had a fatal flaw: motive. There was no clear reason for such extreme violence, and no evidence linking any dismissed worker to the scene at the time of the murders. Knowledge alone wasn't enough. Not for a crime this structured. As the investigation widened, suspicion drifted closer to home. Literally, neighbors. People who lived within reach of the farm. People who might have observed routines without being noticed. This theory introduced something unsettling. The idea that the killer didn't need to infiltrate. They only needed observation. But again, it failed where it mattered most. No neighbor could be definitively tied to the attic presence. No one had been seen entering the property during the critical window. And no one had behavior patterns that matched post-crime occupation. It remained a theory of proximity, without connection. At one point, investigators considered something darker: internal conflict, family tension, inheritance disputes, hidden violence already inside the home. This theory wasn't based on random speculation. It came from something real: reports of arguments, tension within the household, control issues involving Andreas Gruber. But even this theory struggled, because it didn't explain the external footprints, or the attic presence, or the behavior after the murders. It explained emotion, but not occupation. No matter which suspect was considered, one detail remained unchanged. The farm behaved like it was still being used after the murders. That single fact invalidated almost every external theory, because outsiders don't usually remain. Outsiders leave. But here, something stayed. Years later, fragments of police notes and personal accounts revealed something important. Not an official ruling, not a published statement, but a quiet consensus among some investigators. The killer had to have intimate knowledge of the property. Not just access, not just opportunity, but familiarity so deep it blurred the line between visitor and occupant. And that idea led them back to one terrifying possibility. The killer may have been inside the house before the murders ever began. One investigator described Hinterkaifeck in a way that still stands out in historical records. He didn't call it a crime scene. He called it a system, a closed environment where movement was predictable, routines were known, isolation created control, fear could spread without outside interruption, and once a system like that is understood, it can be exploited quietly, gradually, until the people inside no longer recognize what is happening. This is the theory that still lingers over Hinterkaifeck today, not officially proven, but never fully dismissed. The idea is simple and terrifying. The killer wasn't an intruder in the traditional sense. They were an occupant, someone who had established presence inside the farm before the murders, someone who understood the rhythms of the house, someone who could move without drawing attention. And when the moment came, they didn't break in, they didn't escape. They simply continued existing in the space they already controlled. Even after the killings, eventually the investigation ended. Not with closure, but with exhaustion. Files were archived, witnesses passed away, the farm itself was demolished in the years that followed, as if removing the structure could remove the memory. But it didn't, because Hinterkaifeck is not remembered for what was solved, it is remembered for what wasn't. Hinterkaifeck remains one of the most disturbing unsolved cases in history, not because of the brutality, but because of the implication left behind, that someone could commit a mass murder and still remain inside the same space afterward, undetected, unconfirmed, unfinished. And even today, more than a century later, the same question returns every time the case is studied. Was the killer someone who came from outside, or someone who never needed to leave in the first place? Because sometimes the most terrifying crime scene isn't the moment everything ends. It's the moment you realize it never really did.